Unfortunately, I hope I'm not the one who is breaking this news to you. The Bernie Sanders campaign has ended. He is no longer running for president, but his ideas and the movement he has built are going to last well beyond the end of his campaign, and that is why we are all here today. So even though the campaign is over, the fight continues, and here in Pennsylvania, the primary hasn't even happened yet. It's been put off until June. And in addition to Bernie, we had 3 candidates who are running for State House and State Senate who our DSA chapter have endorsed, Nikhil Saval, Rick Krajewski, and Elizabeth Fiedler. So all 3 of them are still running in their races. Bernie is obviously still on the ballot as well. And it's important that we fight to put these people into the State House and keep fighting for the platform that we all care about. $15 minimum wage, Green New Deal, Medicare for all that stuff, still very much, on the table. The fight continues. Even if you're not in Philly, I know we have some people from Connecticut, some people who are joining us remotely. There's still a lot, I think, that you can take away from, and welcome, thank you for coming. There's still a lot that you can take away from this in terms of why we believe as socialists we should be fighting these sorts of battles, and also how to organize during this time when we can't do canvassing, which is our kind of like bread and butter main way to organize, is going door to door and talking to people. You can't do that, but there are still ways to have organizing conversations, and we're going to train you on how to do that. So I think that that about does it. What I guess I'll give you a brief overview. In a moment, we're going to split up into small groups and just kind of do introductions. Then when we come back, the Philly DSA Policy Committee, we have Jason and Khalil from the Policy Committee are going to give us a bit of a talk, just explaining, what people like Nikhil and Rick would be able to do with this sort of state legislative power if we can actually get them into Harrisburg, and why socialists should be fighting these sorts of battles. Then after their training, we're going to turn things over to the canvassing committee, and we are going to teach you basically organizing skills that you can use when you're phone banking, whether you're phone banking for these candidates, whether you're phone banking for Bernie and Dsa Paul's new bill, which would expand Medicare to cover all medical costs during this crisis, or whether you're phone banking for some other project that you're working on in your chapter. So that is about does it for my intro. Thank you again for coming. I think, Hadass, are we ready to split into groups?
Yeah, we're going to split into groups, and I think it will be about 5 minutes in the groups, and then we'll come back together, and hopefully it won't be too jarring when you're booted out of your group. And so we're going to turn it over to the policy committee now, and Jason, I think that's you, right?
Yep. Thanks, Hadass, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to share my screen, and I hope this works okay. All right, just give me one moment here. Okay, can everyone see this okay? Yes, I'm getting some affirmation. Okay, cool. Just give me 1 second here. All right, so as Hadass mentioned, Khalil and I are with the Philly DSA Policy Committee. We're a committee within the chapter that works on sort of policy questions and can serve as a resource. So we've been doing these trainings, giving a breakdown of Bernie's platform and agenda previously, but today we're gonna switch gears to talk about Nikhil and Rick's campaigns. So we're going to present in 2 big sections. So the first, I'm going to cover some analysis. I'm going to give us some general policy analysis education. I'm going to talk about some common term that I think is important for understanding Rick and Nikhil's campaigns. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about what state level policy looks like. And then I'm going to turn it over to Khalil, and he's going to go into sort of the details of Rick and Nikhil's policies on a few different topics. All right. So what I want to get out of this analysis section that I'm going to present on is two things. So one, I'm mostly hoping that we can get some understanding, or we can learn some concepts and tools and ways of thinking about policy that'll help us draw out patterns every time that we look at a candidate's platform or a piece of legislation, and help us make judgments about what that policy is doing, what it means for people involved, and really whether it fits our framework of what socialist politics or left politics should look like. The other thing is I want these concepts, I want the one main concept I'm going to talk about today to be useful for you when looking at other things, and to help you sort of understand the news. The reason I picked this particular concept is because I think it's very relevant for the COVID crisis that's going on right now. So it sort of helps explain some of the tension between different governmental actors at the moment. So this concept that I'm going to talk about is called devolution, which is kind of an odd term, but it's a term common in the policy world. What this is, or actually, before I get into it, I'm going to do just a brief moment of high school civics. So the thing to remember is we're talking about 3 times 3. And what that means is that we have 3 branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. I'm sure everyone learned this in high school. The legislative makes the laws, the executive branch administers the laws, and then the judicial branch interprets the law and decides whether someone should be punished for breaking the law, what a violation looks like, all of that. The other piece that we need to think about is that there are 3 levels of government, and each level has each of these 3 branches. So at the federal level, we have Congress, the presidential administration, and the Supreme Court and other federal courts. At the state level, we have the same thing, and it varies by state. And then often at the local level, which is a county or a town or a city, we have these 3 branches. So we need to keep in mind that we're talking about 3 branches, and each with 3 bodies, for 9 total bodies. Or sorry, 3 levels and 3 branches. Yeah. Okay. So devolution in particular is about a transfer of power from a higher level, something like the federal government, transferring power to a lower level, like a state or local government. And for this to be devolution, for this to fit the definition, the higher level has to hold the right to do something, to legislate about something or regulate people's behavior in some way, and has to give over that right to a state or local body. Or in the case of state devolution, the state has to hold the right to do something, but then give over that right to the local body. And this can be the case for 3 different areas. This can be the case for legislation. So the federal government can legislate something, and as part of that legislation say that the states need to pass legislation. They can do it for rulemaking, so they can say that a state body like a Department of Education needs to make a rule regarding this legislation they just passed. Or they can do it for administration, which is to say maybe the state needs to create a new bureaucracy so that they can administer a social welfare program. So that's devolution. A higher level of government has to transfer power to a lower level of government, and has to tell that lower level of government or allow that lower level of government to legislate, make a rule, or administer something on their behalf. So we say that power is devolved from the federal level to the state level, or from the state level to the county or municipal level. I hope that's clear enough. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to throw them in the chat. And then Khalil and I will look through the chat at the end and take some Q&A. So if you have questions, just formulate and type them up, and we'll answer them by the end. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is state action, which is sort of what we're going to focus on with Rick and Nikhil's campaign. What can they do in the state legislature? Why should we care about state action? Why is state action important to a socialist program, socialist politics at all? So the thing I want to emphasize is that the legislators in Harrisburg have a lot of control over what we do, and they also have a lot of control over the public purse. They're not very popular. They have lately tended to pass fewer laws than they had previously, and they're often sort of stifled with fights and bitterness and a lot of tension with the executive branch, the governorship. But they do have a lot of power over fiscal policy, over what the state pays for. An instance of this, and a good instance of devolution, is that state legislature and the state agencies decide how to spend federal money. So in the instance of Medicaid, this is federal money for the Medicaid program that is given to the states, and each state legislature and governor can, for instance, accept Medicaid expansion money and then figure out how to administer the program or expand the program, or they can refuse Medicaid expansion money under the Affordable Care Act. Similarly, the state legislature can attach work requirements to Medicaid funding. So they can say if you're going to be covered under Medicaid for your health needs, you have to have some sort of work requirement, and this in effect punishes the undeserving poor. Additionally, we know of local housing authorities like the Philadelphia Housing Authority, or PHA, but states can also act as housing authorities. This is not the case in Pennsylvania, but this is the case in other states. So just as a general rule, states can often do things that we don't really recognize as being at the state level of power, where they can sort of usurp power from the lower level. And I'm going to get into a little bit more of that. Another thing that I want to cover is that, oh, sorry, I'm a slide behind. This is a graph of fund expenditures and revenues passed by the Pennsylvania state legislature over the past couple of decades. All right. So the other thing I want to get into is the state's ability to pass legislation and establish institutions of their own. So in many cases, they do this when the federal government refuses to intervene in a certain policy area. So a nice example of this, in my opinion, is things like pension systems for public employees. So PSERS, the Public School Employees Retirement System, was set up for public teachers. This is an area where the federal government has basically said, we don't care about pensions for state employees, you states take care of it yourselves. And in some of these examples, pension funds that are run at the state level are overseen by state boards, and as is the case in Pennsylvania, are actually partially chosen and have to be confirmed by the state legislature. I believe it's, I think 2 state senators and 2 state House reps actually serve on the board of PSERS and have sort of some control over how the pension operates. There are also some great historical examples of when these pensions funds were failing, had failed, were about to fail, and lower levels of government were effectively told they are responsible for it failing. The federal government was unwilling to provide money, and this could be the case in the near future, as there was evidence even yesterday that Mitch McConnell in the Senate is refusing to intervene on states' behalfs to help shore up funding for things like their pension systems. All right, another thing I want to talk about is the state budget in particular. So here in Pennsylvania, every year the state has to pass a budget. They receive a proposal from the governor, and then there's this huge political debate which lasts months, in which the state legislature sort of negotiates within itself and with the governor over what should be in the budget. And always a huge sticking point for this, especially during the Wolf administration, is education funding, K-12 education funding. So here I have a graph which is the distribution of funds that go to K-12 institutions in Pennsylvania. And we can see that a good chunk, just over a third, are received from the state. And a little over half are sort of collected at the federal level via property taxes and other types of taxes levied at the local level. The pie chart that we're looking at is actually, I think from maybe 2015 or 2016. And this is a snapshot of a moment where the state has actually decreased its percentage of funding to K-12 school districts and schools over the course of the last 30 or 40 years. I believe from mid-1970s, the state has significantly decreased the amount of funding it sends. We also, particularly in Pennsylvania, have a big disparity when it comes to how that orange part of the pie, the local taxes, are levied and how they're distributed within school districts. So richer school districts, sort of by definition, are able to levy more taxes and have more monies, whereas poorer school districts are not able to levy those taxes. And a great example of this is Philadelphia, as well as Harrisburg, Reading, Erie, and Allegheny County. But in Pennsylvania, we have a great disparity between rich and poor districts, as exemplified in the graph on the right. All right, one other quick thing I want to talk about is preemption. So this is a particularly difficult point for Philadelphians. We are rated as a first-class city, and I mean that not just because Philadelphia is a great city, but in Pennsylvania law, we are literally called a first-class city, and we are partly overseen by this Urban Affairs Subcommittee on first-class cities, Philadelphia being the only first-class city in Pennsylvania, because we are the only city with more than 1 million people. And Martina White, who represents the Northeast, part of Northeast Philly, is the chair of this Urban Affairs Subcommittee, and somehow is given sort of outsized control over what the state legislature does when it comes to Philadelphia. And this concept of preemption, which is when the state preempts local authorities from being able to do things, is often run through this Urban Affairs Subcommittee, or is just run through the legislature generally. In these instances, Harrisburg actually restricts what local municipalities can do. So they've been able to restrict some things that city council can do. Here are some examples of restrictions. These are, this is an analysis of all 50 states. So let's see here. 28 states across the country have minimum wage preemption laws of some sort. 42 have tax and expenditure limitations of some sort, which is to say they can tax in a certain way or spend in a certain way. And the state limits what a city council can do. We've seen Harrisburg try to attempt this with the soda tax. They've tried to fight it with litigation and passing preemption laws. They've also attempted this with a paid sick leave law that Philadelphia passed a few years ago. And there are other instances like minimum wage and municipal broadband, where the city is always pushing up against the power of the state as the state tries to control what municipalities are doing. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Khalil. Khalil, do you want me to keep presenting? And I'll just click the slides.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. I guess it's a little bit easier than me sharing. Thank you.
No problem.
And we can go to, honestly, we can just go to the next slide. Thanks. And hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Please let me know if you can't. So my apologies, I joined a few minutes late, had some issues logging on, but my name is Khalil Mans. Been a member of Philly DSA for 2 years or so and member of the at-large steering committee. But to continue on with the presentation, what I wanted to focus on specifically was looking at Rick and Nikhil's policy positions and seeing, what is actually being talked about at the state level. So just a little bit of background here. We have Nikhil Saval, Democratic ward leader, organizer, co-founder of a progressive group called Reclaim Philadelphia, has worked with the Bernie Sanders campaign in the past, and he is running for the first district Senate seat in Philadelphia. And my apologies, I didn't get a chance to include it, but domain, his website, if you're interested in learning more, is simply nikhilsaval.com. And to the right, we have Rick Krajewski running for state representative in the 188th district. So that's kind of looking at West Philly, I guess the Spruce Hill, parts of University City, Cobbs Creek sort of neighborhoods. And in terms of just a little bit about him, has long been a criminal justice organizer, engineer, educator, and artist, and he's seen the effects of trauma firsthand in terms of housing security, the war on drugs, racism, and capitalism in general. And his website is rickforwestphilly.com. Next slide, please. And so jointly, they released a COVID-19 recovery platform. And in terms of what they're calling for, again, some of this is certainly at the state level and what they can advocate for. And also, I think, just broader things that could certainly help with the response to this issue. But in terms of the pillar of that recovery platform, they're calling for an economic justice and labor portion, a housing for all, healthcare for all, a safe and equitable education, and a green stimulus and mass liberation. So really what they're doing is taking this issue and tying it into some of their existing issues in a true progressive fashion. So just to point out a few parts to those pillars, I didn't go over everything for any interest of time. In terms of what they're calling for from an economic justice and labor position, they're calling for support of at least $2,000 for families, regardless of their immigration status, and demanding that the state can fill in any of those gaps that may be left with any lack in the federal relief effort overall. In terms of housing, they're asking for a mortgage and rent moratorium. And in addition to that, they're also asking for direct assistance that's modeled after a Philly subsidy program. So just calling for additional aid there to go directly to Pennsylvania residents. In terms of how they're tying it into some of their existing healthcare positions, they're asking for a suspension of medical debt, something that they would advocate the PA Attorney General work on. And my apologies, I'm actually not sure how that would work, but that's what I've seen listed in their platform. So happy to follow up and see if we can get more information on that. And also asking for the protection equipment, reaching out to the governor, Tom Wolf, to use any emergency powers that he can, as well as coordinating with other states to see if, similar to what's being talked about at the federal level, to see if it can be done at a state level. And I also thought this was really noteworthy to point out. They're calling for, tied to their education platform, that school cleaning that's done in relationship to COVID-19 also include funding for lead and asbestos remediation. So for those that don't know, that's one of the really big issues and a big part of their platform in Philadelphia in general, dealing with not only lead, asbestos, mold, rodents in schools and in really unsafe conditions for not only students, but also teachers. And again, I mentioned the other pillars that we won't focus on in the interest of time. Next slide, please. So in terms of their more broader policy points, that last slide was specifically related to COVID-19, but just wanted to talk about some of the things that they're focusing on that has a more local tint. So in terms of education, and everything that we see in that left-hand column specifically comes from Nikhil Saval's platform. A lot of what we see on the right comes from Rick's platform, but truthfully, they really have very similar policy points. I just specifically pulled these items from their sites. And in terms of the facilities, they're again calling for the removal of lead, asbestos, and mold, and also making sure that any new construction, it has a focus on some of the more green aspects to it. And again, that ties into not only the federal level Green New Deal plans, but also what they've talked about that would focus on Philadelphia. And in addition to that, just that point, they're also, in this case, Nikhil is calling for having our schools act as community hubs. So subsidizing the use of schools, if needed, for nonprofit and community groups, for citizen training and mobilization, providing subsidies for both urban and rural schools to have access to agricultural programs and any additional programs. So really thinking about at a state level how we can transform Philadelphia, and not only Philadelphia, but Pennsylvania as a whole. In terms of some other education-related points, they focus on the curriculum, in specific, looking at how we can keep those public funds and institutions locally, and making sure that public or unionized employees are sort of the ones that we keep in mind when we're talking about all of this development. And calling out a reinvestment, actually, in nurses and counselors and other support-related positions that are related to our schools, many of which were cut in 2011 at the state level due to those budget restrictions. And also calling for the recruitment and hiring of underrepresented groups. In terms of the budgeting or freedom budgeting aspect, I think this ties in a lot to what Jason was mentioning. So they're just talking about not only how we can get additional funding, but how we can transform how the schools are funded to begin with. One of those that I called out that many people might actually be familiar with is ending the tax abatement. And just to make sure I touch on things that are specifically related to Rick, just asking for at the state level a stand against any charter school legislation that threatens to pull any funding from the public schools. And also similarly tied to what Nikhil is calling for, advanced legislation that makes sure that funding schools from the beginning is what we have in mind. And also, I just added in this last bullet point here to simply make sure that we heavily invest in higher education by holding our state budget accountable to properly funding our community colleges. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. In terms of what they're asking for from a housing standpoint, Nikhil, again, he's on the left, really is calling for a homes guarantee. And when doing research with Bernie's plan, I feel like a lot of this was not lifted from, but certainly in the spirit of what Bernie had called for in a lot of his housing platform. But realizing that plenty of Pennsylvanians are spending more than 30% of their income on housing, I think that's sort of what the federal level has said is a guideline. And in most cases, people are spending 50, 60, 70%, in some cases more, of their income on housing. So making sure that to address that, we are building, preserving, and converting public housing. Nikhil's plan calls for a goal of 1 million units. And if you think about it, the city of Philadelphia, and I don't know if there's an exact count, has at least a few 100,000 abandoned units, and it's talking about the actual conversion of those or putting them to better use. He also has a pillar that calls for renters' rights and establishing a statewide rent stabilization program, as well as mandating funding for right to counsel in the case of someone who might be getting evicted. And all of this, I think, is great, but you still have to look at the actual laws that got us into a lot of these situations. So that's why they were calling for changes to our zoning and taxation and land use, and specifically an end to exclusionary zoning. So what that means is that we're not only building housing in the areas that already have affordable housing, or what's called low-income housing, looking at how that can be more equitably distributed around the city and surrounding areas. And again, I think a lot of what Rick is calling for certainly mimics what Nikhil is calling for. Let's just pick one point in the interest of time: support for addressing underlying issues that result in homelessness, with Rick being a representative for West Philly, is certainly something that's a problem in that neighborhood as well as citywide. So certainly something that's important to try and address. Next slide, please. And sorry, I thought there was another one there. So yeah, just to sort of wrap things up in the interest of time, what I would want you to focus on is just that ability to make sure that we're, whether it's phone banking or simply talking to other people, making sure we're keeping these dates in mind, that we want to have everyone registered to vote by May 18th. If you're looking to request a mail-in ballot, hopefully everyone is to stay safe. We want to make sure that you request it by May 20th, and also mailing in your ballot by May 26th. And Jason, if you can go one more slide. I actually think I did them out of order. There might be one more slide left. If not, that's okay. I thought there was one more.
That's all I'm seeing, sorry.
Okay, nope, that's fine. And so I can actually just talk to it really quickly. It was basically just a slide that compares, what we see for an incumbent, a sort of tail of the tape with one of our local representatives, comparing it to Nikhil, but happy to send that out to people if there's any interest. So wanted to keep it short and contained here. But I think in general, if you're interested in learning more about either candidate, their websites have been great sources of information. They're also active on social media as well. Thanks. I'll turn it back over to the other co-hosts.
Thanks, Khalil. So if you want to take a second, if you have any questions about what either Khalil or I went over, feel free to throw them in the chat. I already have one sent to me, so just take 10, 20 seconds to think about any questions you might have had.
Yeah, and Jason, I have one as well, so we can I guess address both.
Great. So one I received from Chuck, they asked whether I could go over ways that the Pennsylvania legislature limits how people get welfare resources, similar to Medicaid requirements, Medicaid work requirements, getting a job in some states. So this is an interesting question. I don't think that Pennsylvania has any additional Medicaid requirements. To take Medicaid as an example, the federal government issues some requirements of what a Medicaid program has to look like. They say you have to be insuring people who are at a certain income level, a certain percentage of the poverty level, or under. I don't believe, and then states are given the opportunity to sort of like play with those requirements. There's a sort of baseline threshold and they have the ability to change them or tweak them in small ways. I don't think Pennsylvania does that. In terms of other welfare resources, I don't think we have any. It's usually instituted by Republican governors, and it's only become more fashionable sort of during the teens when Wolf was governor. But I will say that one way that you see sort of like some mismanagement in Pennsylvania when it comes to welfare resources is that the state actually devolved its administration of these programs to the county level. So what that means is if I need to get on Medicaid and SNAP, used to be food stamps, but the food access program for people who are at a certain poverty level or lower. If I want to get those things, I interact with the state for my application. So this is federal money that goes to the state. The state sets up an application process to administer it partially. And so I apply on a state website. And then when it comes to following up and actually getting like my card for SNAP and figuring out how my benefits work, I talk to a county office. And what this means is, of course, when you disaggregate something from the state level to the county level, there can be a whole lot of areas for messing things up or for a lot of sort of unnecessary variation, a lack of uniformity, if you will. So my relationship with the Philadelphia County office could fall apart. They could handle it not that well. Or if I move out of Philadelphia, say into Montgomery County, to transfer those benefits, I might have to arrange to talk to a different office, and then I get a different case manager. And any updates to my status go to that office instead. So there's just an opportunity for the handover to not work as well. But when it comes to actual requirements on welfare resources, I don't believe Pennsylvania has any at the moment. None come to mind. We generally just take the federal requirements.
And Jason, sorry, did you have another one?
Go ahead.
Okay, and would want to lean on you for perhaps a better definition. So how would we define public housing? Like what do we mean when we say public housing in the traditional sense?
I suppose the way to define it is housing stock that is not always built, but typically owned or managed by a public housing authority. So the case here is that the federal government, the HUD, Housing and Urban Development Department, sends a lot of money to what they call local housing authorities. And as I mentioned earlier, these can be at the state level, but typically they're even more localized. They are like the Philadelphia Housing Authority that only operates in the city of Philadelphia. And PHA then manages and owns certain public housing properties. So these are residential properties in the city of Philadelphia that are run, overseen by this public board, the PHA. But I will say construction of those houses can often be contracted out to private entities. That's extremely common.
Awesome, and that was all the questions I had.
I see another question about the current funding structure for funding streams. So could you just clarify, is it a particular funding stream or a policy area like welfare policy or education policy? Or housing, something like that.
And if there's, sorry, I know a lot of people on mute. I don't know if that's like chat enabled. If not, always happy to sort of follow up with an answer. I'm sure we can definitely do that.
Yeah, I think this was Chris asked about the current funding structure. Chris, do you mind clarifying the question a little bit?
Sure. I was just saying, like, where each program's money comes from in terms of taxation or federal taxation, state taxation, or like which programs are funded by what money already?
Sure. So there are tons of programs. I'll just pick a few to maybe help distinguish them. So
We could draw a chart that has all the money going to which program, that kind of thing.
Well, it's thousands of programs, so it's a little hard to put in a chart. But I'll say, so as we were just talking about housing, a lot of the money for public housing and for Section 8 vouchers and other sort of housing supports generally come from HUD at the federal level and then go to the states or local housing authorities. Similarly, Medicaid is federal money as just part of the standard federal budget that then gets allocated to the states. And this is done through, there's sort of like automatic stabilizers for when there are changes in the economy. The federal government will give more money to states or less money to states, depending on the conditions, economic conditions. Maybe another example, a good example is education, because the funding for education is very complex. There are federal funding sources, but they're very small. There are also federal grants given out by the Department of Education that are a bit more sizable, but you have to meet certain conditions like any other grant. You sort of apply, and you have to meet thresholds and sort of prove it. And then states will often receive money from the federal government to administer certain things about educational programs or to do sort of like a statewide initiative. Additionally, states give money to school districts, and school districts use and depend on a lot of that money for a lot of their programs. And cities and counties, and in Pennsylvania, we have intermediate units. They all have the ability to levy taxes locally to raise funds for their school districts. So the city of Philadelphia has some taxes that fund the school district of Philadelphia. The Board of Education here in Philadelphia doesn't have much say, or they don't technically have much say over that as far as I understand. But then the intermediate units in some of our counties have the ability to levy taxes, and the townships and the cities in suburban counties of Philadelphia have the ability to levy property taxes on top of that. So that's just to help sort of, education funding is very complicated, so I hope that just helps sort of clarify how messy it can get for all sorts of programs. All right, I think we're pretty close to time, but if anyone has any final questions, feel free to throw them in the chat at the last minute. Yeah, but otherwise I will throw it over to Vicky to take us into the organizing training, which I'm looking forward to. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Sorry, I'm getting a random call and they get sent to my computer, which is very annoying. So hi everyone, my name is Vicky. I'm going to briefly introduce everyone to phone banking, go over a brief overview of how an organizing conversation is structured, and focus on the first part of that, which is the introduction and getting to finding the issue. So as many of you know, especially those of you in Philly who have canvassed with us, you know, having issue-based conversations is one of the best ways to build our power and our movement. This was sort of the backbone of the Bernie campaign. If you guys have, you know, used the Bernie dialer or canvassed at all, you know that you were always talking about issues. And so this is what we want to continue doing when we're on the phone. There's nothing really fundamentally different about that. And, you know, one of the other things that I think is really important to point out is that, like in a lot of what made Bernie different, RIP to the campaign, was that his campaign wasn't about him. It was about the issues and the programs that he supported. This, I think, makes for a much better conversation when you're at the doors or when you're on the phone. So this is something to keep in mind as you're familiarizing yourself with how to have these conversations. The point isn't really to talk about Nikhil and Rick and how great they are, or Liz Fiedler, or whichever candidate you're talking about, if you're talking about candidates. It's to talk about the issues that face working people every single day and connect them to a program that can change their lives and materially benefit them. So, that's just something I want to frame the entire rest of this portion of the training. Issue-based conversations are used in campaigns when you're at the doors. They're used in actual union organizing conversations. And you can actually use them when you're debating someone. If you're arguing with a friend or a family member, you can, use these tools to sort of win those people over. Sometimes it takes more than one conversation, but these are tactics that can be used in different contexts. So very useful thing to understand. So first I wanted to ask people, who here has phone banked before? If you could just click the little, you could put up your hands, or you could click the little yes. It looks like most people with screens have phone banked before. Okay, cool. So this is good. So most of you have some familiarity with the sort of mechanics of phone banking and how it differs from having a conversation face-to-face with people. But for those of you who have not phone banked before, I want to point out a few of the key differences. So first, unlike canvassing at the door or maybe having a face-to-face conversation with a friend or a family member, you have some advantages. You can have a fact page up, you can have your wrap or script up. You can have a candidate's issue page open in front of you. So, if you get a question that you don't necessarily know the answer to, if someone asks you about, what does Nikhil think about education? You can go to his page and you can look it up. This may make some people more comfortable and may make you commit to phone banking. And if so, keep this in mind. Open up those pages, review them before you start making calls, and then you can have them there as a backup. Again, I prefer face-to-face conversations and canvassing, but this is one of the really nice things about phone banking. So we went from best case scenario or best thing about phone banking to worst thing, which is the worst thing that can happen to you when you are phone banking is that someone may be mean to you. Okay, it will not end your world. You will be okay. Some people are really nasty, but this really doesn't happen all that often. And if it does happen, you politely end the conversation. Thank you for taking the time to speak to me. Have a nice day. Click, you're done. That's it. It sucks. I'm not going to lie and say that it's a great feeling, but it's very easy to get out of these conversations. It's actually a lot easier than if you are having a face-to-face conversation at the doors. But the other two things to keep in mind, these are definitely more in line with phone banking as opposed to canvassing. If someone is still on the phone with you, even though they're maybe not totally agreeing with you, you can still keep talking to them and trying to persuade them. Don't stay on the line and take lots of abuse from someone if they're, if the conversation has gone that way. But if someone is maybe, giving you a little bit of grief in terms of, well, I don't know how that's possible. You still have them. They're still talking to you. So you can continue to try. But obviously use your judgment. You don't want to be on a 25-minute phone call that's going nowhere. Just as if you were at the doors, you don't want to argue with someone for a really long time when you could be having productive conversations with other people. One other thing that has been brought up is that you might find out that the person that you are calling for has died recently. I know that this has happened to some of our phone bankers, and I think especially now with coronavirus, this is like a possibility, a very real possibility. So if that happens, just be very gracious and say, I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you very much and have a nice day. Just acknowledge that and say you're sorry, and then, let them go. So with that, I'm just going to briefly go over the parts of the conversation. So right now with, I see some comments in the chat. So right now we are in the middle of this coronavirus pandemic, and we have sort of changed how we start our conversations. Normally we would start with just a basic introduction. Hi, my name is Vicky. I'm a volunteer out here talking to people about X, Y, or Z, or I'm here for Rick Krajewski for West Philadelphia. But because people are dealing with coronavirus, we have sort of switched this up and are asking people how they're holding up. So the point of this is because people, this is the number one thing on people's minds, and we want to acknowledge that. And also, a lot of the issues that people are experiencing with coronavirus right now are tied to the things that we normally talk about, the issues that we normally talk about. So things like healthcare access, lots of economic impact, people don't know how they're going to pay for food. If they're still waiting for their $1,200 measly check to come through, or maybe they're an essential worker and their boss has not given them masks or gloves. So we've sort of reframed this for coronavirus, and this is part of our introduction to sort of get to the next section, which is discussing issues and sort of trying to find the issue. So after you've, introduced yourself, said who you are, and, you ask for the person and hopefully they say that they are the right person, you ask them, how have you been holding up with this coronavirus pandemic? Let them talk. This is really important. You want to be listening to them. Next part is, like I said, discussing issues. So hopefully once you've asked them how they're holding up, they'll tell you, I've lost my job recently and I don't know how I'm going to be able to pay my utility bills, or let alone my rent. That's an issue for you to talk about. So hopefully they're willing to open up to you in that moment. And you can then use that issue that they've raised, that very personal issue, to connect it to, whatever you're calling them about. So we're going to be talking later about this healthcare plan that Bernie and Pramila Jayapal have introduced. And this is one of the things that we're going to be phone banking for. And I believe DSA nationally is going to be pushing every member to phone bank for this. After you've sort of connected to that person's issues, you're going to agitate, inoculate. So what you're trying to do here is, once you've identified their issue, you're going to get them a little angry. You want them to understand that the issue that they're experiencing is, that they have a right to be angry about it. So you're going to, rile them up a little bit, identify the source of their problem, and then you're hopefully going to inspire some hope. And Hadassah is going to talk about that later. And then lastly, you will then ask them something. You're going to ask them to do something. You want to be clear with this, and you want to make sure that they follow through with it. This is the most important part of the conversation. You're not just trying to, have a conversation. You want to get this person to do something, whether it's vote for your candidate, call their representative, whatever it may be. So I just want to briefly, to make this short, just talk about finding the issue in that introduction piece. So in a conversation, you're doing this by asking questions. So like I said, with the coronavirus introduction, you're asking the person, how are you holding up? And what you're trying to do is help this person realize how they're feeling about whatever issue it is you're canvassing for. So if it's healthcare, or coronavirus response, or if you're talking to someone about candidates and those candidates support particular issues, there are different ways that you can structure this. And we'll be sharing an example of a wrap that you can, follow. So that way you have an idea of like how one kind of conversation could go. I just want to specify what a good organizing issue is. So this is something that is widely felt, deeply felt. It's a winnable issue, and it builds the movement. So normally, you know, when before coronavirus, like I mentioned, we would kind of list a few issues. I would say that I'm a volunteer, and that I'm out here talking to people about healthcare and education, and workers' rights. Do any of these issues mean anything to you? So that's like one quick way to sort of introduce things. But with the coronavirus, again, you're going to listen to what they're sharing with you, and hopefully you'll see something with, whether it's, again, healthcare, housing, economic issues, workers' rights, that you can then connect them to. So I already mentioned that you need to listen more than you talk. There is a rough rule of you should be listening 70% of the time and talking 30% of the time. This can be very hard for people, especially if you don't like sitting in an awkward silence. None of us like that, but it is necessary to listen and to not dominate the conversation. You know, be prepared to sit through an awkward silence if someone isn't willing to open up immediately to you, or maybe they need a minute to think about how they want us to respond. So just sit with that silence. Let me see here. So I want to get back to that Healthcare Emergency Guarantee Act wrap that we've been talking about. So after I've introduced myself and asked the person about coronavirus and how they're holding up, I would say in this instance, and the point of this wrap is to get someone to call their representative or senator to get them to support these bills. I'd say something like, I'm calling today because, you know, unfortunately, Bernie Sanders has suspended his campaign, but we still have to carry on the fight for issues that affect everyone's lives right now, especially making sure that everyone has access to healthcare and can afford coronavirus treatment, and making sure that workers are protected in this very scary time. Right now, there is a Healthcare Emergency Guarantee Act in Congress that would cover everyone's healthcare costs until we have a coronavirus vaccine. Is this something that you want your representative to support? So, you know, you're introducing an issue, and in this case, you're kind of getting to an ask already, but you're still giving them the opportunity to discuss that issue with you. You're asking them, do you want your representative to support this? So the last thing I wanted to talk about very quickly is how to deal with someone who's giving you nothing. So this happens sometimes. You call someone, you ask them how they're holding up, and they're like, I'm fine. And that could be awkward because it's kind of hard to imagine who's doing fine in this time, but it happens. Sometimes people don't necessarily want to share immediately, or maybe they are doing fine. Maybe they don't know anyone who's touched by this crisis, but more often than not, that's not the case. And again, I want to remind you that if someone's willing to stay on the phone with you, you still have these opportunities to connect with them. So what I usually say when someone says, you know, I'm fine, I straight up ask them, do you know anyone who's lost their job because of, you know, this coronavirus pandemic? Or do you know anyone who's gotten sick with coronavirus? This is an easy way to make this issue connect to them in another way. It may not individually affect them, but this, more than likely than not, it affects someone they know. And so this is one easy way to sort of get around someone who's really not engaging with you. But sometimes people say, no, I don't know anyone. And you can try introducing your ask after that, but more often than not, they're probably going to try and get off the phone with you. But I want you to understand that just because someone isn't necessarily engaging immediately doesn't mean that they're not going to listen to you or share with you later on. You may just have to ask in another way, or bring up another issue if you're not talking about coronavirus and you're talking about something else. So with that, I want to hand it over to Hadass, who's going to talk about agitating.
Great, thank you, Vicki. So if you look in the chat, you can see, I think Vicki mentioned this, but a link to a wrap if you want to just get a sense of the kind of wraps that we do, that we've been doing. So I'm going to run through this kind of quickly, but if you have any questions, feel free to message me and I can try to respond to that. So Vicky laid out a lot of tools that you can use to try to find an issue. And then what I'm going to go over is agitating and getting people to start thinking about that issue politically and building hope and trying to mobilize them. And so agitating is when you first kind of like empathize and build up anger and then move that into mobilization. And I think maybe a helpful way would be to just go over an example of this. So Jason and Cleo talked a little bit about what education can look like in Philadelphia. And oftentimes at doors, we would get folks who were frustrated with the education system or the asbestos in their school, et cetera. And so one way to, first you want to acknowledge that and empathize with that. And you also want to ask questions that would encourage someone to think about those issues politically versus like a more personal kind of grievance. So you can ask questions along the lines of why do you think your schools are poorly funded? Whose interests does that serve? What changes would you want to see in your schools? Are these problems your neighbors also have? So moving the anger into this political realm. And then you also want to encourage that anger since it can be useful in terms of mobilization. So one thing I've talked about a lot at doors, because almost no matter who I talk to, if they're Republican, if they were Bernie supporters, if they weren't, would be upset about this, is that UPenn doesn't pay any property taxes because it's a nonprofit. It's got a $15 billion endowment, and almost every other Ivy League has set up something called the pilot program. Columbia and Penn are the only ones that haven't. A pilot program is still kind of shitty. They'll pay like 25% of what would normally be the property taxes to help fund schools and other things that property taxes normally fund. So I find that this can be like a useful thing to mention because it helps people realize that they're paying into their school system and one of the largest owners of property in West Philadelphia isn't. And a school that greatly benefits by being in this neighborhood doesn't contribute much to it, except for they pay for some education for professors' kids pretty much at one school. That's what they've set up instead of a pilot program. So so that's a way that sometimes builds up anger. Most people don't get too jazzed about that unless they're a Penn administrator, which we usually don't run into here anyway. And but the point is not just to be like, and now I'm done, and now you're upset. You want to make them feel hopeful and that there's reason to start doing something about it. So there are initiatives in Philadelphia to address this. One is to pressure Mayor Kenney. There's already a resolution in the city council a resolution that this kind of program should be established. The mayor's not doing anything about it, but there's a pressure campaign some DSA members, I know Katie Radar, are working on right now. And then also shaming tactics might be helpful here for Penn. And then also just encouraging the tax system to work differently. So trying to build that frustration, connect it to the fact that they're upset at how their school is working, make them think about the political implications of why that might be going poorly, and then build hope and avenues for success. And I think one important thing to remember is that political will is the main issue that we have to deal with. We talked about this last time a little bit, but the fact that there's many trillions of dollars that have suddenly become available shows that political will can change how we think of money and funding and what's possible, and that a lot of the no's we get are nonsense. And even though we hear them all the time, so they're hard to move past. But remembering that the political will is what we're trying to foster, and getting people to feel mobilized and that they have other people, especially that they can work with, to change the things that they're upset about in their lives for very good reason. So that's what agitating would look like in those kind of conversations. And I'm going to turn it over to Tyler.
Thanks. Hey, everyone. So far, Hadass and Vicky have talked mostly about conversations that are going reasonably well. People are receptive. I want to talk a little bit about what to do when hard questions are asked. And in particular, what makes a question hard or challenging is when it reflects some kind of deeply ingrained belief that good things aren't possible, which a lot of people have, and a lot of it's everywhere. So you deal with it a lot, and this can be things like, oh well, we don't have enough money to pay for Medicare for all. You know, speaking of the trillions of dollars that we see mobilized as a function of political will. But so there's lots of different kinds of hard questions that we can come up with. And we have a framework for answering these questions, which is called AAR. It stands for Affirm, Answer, and Redirect. And the idea is that the first thing you want to do is find some common ground with whatever concern or question the person is raising, even if it's kind of hard to find common ground. I mean, this can be something like somebody who thinks Medicare for all is going to be too expensive, somebody who thinks that maybe, let's say, they have good health insurance and they're worried about losing it. So those are some examples of reasonable concerns you can affirm. Like, of course, none of us want to lose our health insurance, and then you can move on from there. There are, of course, more frustrating and difficult concerns to try to figure out what the kernel of something to affirm is in them. For example, when people talk about like, oh well, we can't give healthcare to everyone because then they won't work. Like, obviously, you're just going to be annoyed and want to debate with these people. But there are aspects about that you can affirm and show that you're kind of on the same team. And these have to do with things like, you know, who's benefiting from the current system the most, pointing, you know, towards profits for pharma and insurance executives and stuff like that. So we always want to come up with some way of affirming the concern, letting the person know that you're listening and that you have you know, sort of are on the same team in some way at least. And then you want to answer the question. And so in order to answer the question, it's basically kind of the smallest chunk. You don't want to be too long-winded. You just want to try to be pretty concise. And if you don't really know the answer, then you just want to, you know, point someone to where they could find that information or offer to follow up with them if they're willing to share their contact information. But then the most important thing is that once you've answered the question, you redirect to some new topic, or make it, bring it back to basically the agitation that Hadass was just talking about. So once you've dealt with whatever they've asked, you want to start to do whatever you can to create feelings of desert, feelings that, you know, the good things are possible and that being involved will help make them happen. I want to make sure that I share this document in the chat so that everyone can reference it later, and then also just have a look at it now if you'd like. So the first page goes over AAR as a strategy, and then the second page has a bunch of examples. And I'm just going to go over one of the examples. So we have this question of how will we pay for it? That comes up sometimes. There's a lot of sort of information out there that's just meant to make people think that it's expensive and impossible to implement. So if somebody asks, how are we going to pay for this? You can say something like, this is a question that a lot of people ask because a lot of people have worked hard to make sure their lives and families' lives are stable, and they can't afford a lot of new costs. Of course, I don't want my health insurance to get more expensive. So this is the sort of affirm portion. And then you can answer the question. Medicare for all will run on progressive taxation, where taxes increase only for the richest people. And actually, most of us will save money because we won't be paying premiums, deductibles, copays. And then the key thing is to redirect now that you've answered the question and say something along the lines of, have healthcare costs ever prevented you from doing something that you wanted? You know, there's a lot of different versions of this. Have you ever received a large bill that you didn't anticipate? Anything like that. And I think at first it can feel a little bit invasive to ask these kinds of questions, but once you get used to it, I think you find that people are often very forthcoming and pretty quick to be activated by these kinds of questions. So that's AAR. I would say the main goal of it is that we're avoiding getting into debates. We're trying to show that we're on the same team as people, and then we're trying to help bring them back to asking the kinds of questions that we want them to ask. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sean, unless anyone has any questions.
All right. Thanks, Tyler. Well, so far, you all are doing an excellent job at listening 100% and talking 0%. So pat yourself on the back. We're already on a good track there. I'm here to talk about what it's been like to phone bank for our local down ballot candidates here in Philly. And I guess just to go over again the basic structure of the conversation and how we've been seeing it, and to try to touch on some of the more important things that Vicky and Hadass have already said. So not to oversimplify things too much, but there's really two parts to a conversation for organizing. There's the introduction, and then there's the rest of the conversation. So the rest of the conversation includes talking about political issues, agitating, and culminates in a concrete ask. The introduction is not something to take lightly either, especially when you're on the phone. I mean, think about it from the perspective of whoever you're calling. They've just picked up the phone to find out that they're talking to a complete stranger. From their perspective, they have no idea whether you're going to talk to them for 2 minutes or 20 minutes straight. And they are seriously contemplating hanging up the phone. So you want to get through your introduction quickly. However, you also don't want to get through your introduction too quickly. If at the end of your introduction, you're still, for all intents and purposes, as much of a stranger to this person as when you started off, it's going to be weird and awkward when you start asking them about political issues. Start asking what their opinion is. People don't want to just divulge this stuff, or normal people don't want to divulge this stuff to strangers. So a typical introduction that we've been doing in the age of COVID, you'd say something like, "Hello, my name is Sean. I'm a volunteer representing Rick Krajewski. He's a Democratic politician running for state representative in your district. And we're calling to raise awareness for the June 2nd election that he's running in, and also to check in on our neighbors during this COVID crisis." So first of all, how have you been during, how you've been holding up during the quarantine? And so that's basically the whole introduction. You've introduced who you are, you've made it clear why you're calling, and you've gotten to the point where the other person is hopefully talking as fast as possible. And every now and then you will get someone who is interested in telling you how they're doing. And some people have some really gut-wrenching stories to tell. Don't use this as just an opportunity to wait for someone to say that they're worried about healthcare just so you can pounce and talk to them about how great Medicare for all would be. But do empathize and do be ready to start trying to pull apart these political issues as you move towards the rest of the conversation. I'm going to drop off in just 1 second, but as you work through the latter part of the conversation, always keep your asks in mind. The worst thing that you could do that you'll be kicking yourself later for is having a good conversation with someone, then getting off the phone, then looking at the asks that are in the document in front of you and realizing that you forgot one or forgot two or forgot all of them. It happens, but you'll be kicking yourself if it does. So please try to keep that in the forefront of your mind. And so with that, we can turn things over.
I'm going to make a quick announcement. So we have probably more than 7 minutes left of stuff prepared for you guys. So what we're going to do is run through some demos and then break out into groups and talk a little bit more about strategies, and then give you some information when we wrap up. Obviously, if you have to go at 7:30, that makes complete sense. And if you want to email Philly DSA with questions, I'll put my email address in the chat too if you have any questions. But we're still working out a little bit on how to give you guys good information in a short amount of time. So thank you for bearing with us as we trial and error this a little bit.
All right, so I think that we are doing a demo conversation now. So this is going to be me and Sean demoing before we break out into groups to do a group activity. So I am going to be the caller, and then Sean, if you want to unmute yourself, and you can be the person I'm phone banking. So we just want to show you guys how a conversation can go. And we'll try to keep this a little bit short because we are running out of time. But just to give you a sense of how this works. So ring, ring, ring.
Hello.
Hi, is this Sean?
Yeah, this is me. Who's this?
Hi, Sean. My name is Vicky. I'm a volunteer with Philly DSA. I believe one of our members knocked on your door earlier this year to talk with you about electing Bernie Sanders for president. I know that a lot has changed since then with the coronavirus pandemic. I wanted to ask, how have you been doing recently?
Yeah, I've been fine. Just working from home.
Oh, okay, good. Well, I'm glad that you have the ability to work from home. I know a lot of people don't have that. Do you know anyone who's been adversely impacted by this?
Yeah, I mean, I have a few friends who've been furloughed. I know of a couple people who've just sort of been laid off. From my perspective, I'm good for now, in terms of my work. But all we're doing is just sitting around inside waiting for this virus to stop spreading. No idea when that's going to stop,
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to hear about your friends who have been furloughed. I know people who have lost their jobs too. But I'm glad that you seem to be doing well personally. That's great. I wanted to let you know that I'm calling today because, unfortunately, as you probably know, Bernie Sanders has suspended his campaign. But that does not mean that we just stop fighting for the issues that affect everyone's lives, especially right now. Right now, there is a healthcare emergency guarantee act in Congress that would cover everyone's healthcare costs until we have a coronavirus vaccine. Do you think that this is something you would want your representative to support?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds great. When you guys came around to talk about Bernie a few months ago, it all sounded great to me too. But, meanwhile, Bernie's dropped out of the race. I don't really know what I can keep doing. Wish in one hand, shit in the other. It'd be nice to have free healthcare, but
yeah, you're not sure if you can really have an impact. Is that what I hear?
Yeah, of course. I mean, yeah, I'm not sure what to do, really.
Gotcha. Well, I think that that's a very common sentiment. People feeling sort of powerless right now because a lot of us are stuck inside and unable to do anything. But, putting pressure on your elected officials is one of the key ways that you can affect change in society, especially right now when we are quarantined. If your representative hears from you and thousands of other constituents, they may actually be inclined to vote for this bill. And this bill is very important because, as you know, and as we probably discussed, or, whoever talked to you last time probably talked to you about, a lot of people don't have health care. Having access to quality health care and treatments is one of the best ways that we can counter this virus, right?
Yeah, sure. So you're saying I have to do more than just voting? Is this going to pay off?
That's what I'm saying, because the only way we're going to get things done is if more people like you get involved. And that doesn't mean that you have to run for office or, go out knocking doors all the time, but, having a small action such as calling your representative can make a big difference, especially when it's in concert with lots of other people doing it.
Yep.
So what do you think? Do you think you could make this call?
Yeah, I mean, I guess why the hell not? It'll take
All right.
5 minutes.
Great. Yeah, and I have a script that I can send you to make it a little bit easier for you. So that way you don't have to do any real work. You can read the script and then you would be done. Would you like me to send that to you? I can text it to you.
Yeah, go for it.
Great. I will do that when we get off the phone. I have one more question for you. So, we've been talking about whether or not you can make an impact in our government, and especially right now for people who are suffering. And you mentioned voting, and, you're right. Like, we need to be able to elect people to represent working people and represent our interests. So I wanted to ask you, you live in Pennsylvania's 188th district, and someone named Rick Krajewski is running for state house in your area. He endorsed Bernie Sanders, and he has pledged to carry on the fight for jobs, housing, healthcare, and all of this at the state level. He has also decided to not take any contributions from big pharma or health insurance companies. Would you be willing to support him in the Pennsylvania primary on June 2nd?
You're telling me to go vote?
Yeah, I have good news for you. You can vote by mail.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, yeah, all right. I didn't realize that. I thought you were trying to get me to march off to my death.
No. I don't want to endanger you or anyone else. But yeah, I can tell you about how to vote by mail. It's very easy. And I can also send you the link so that way you can sign up for a mail-in ballot. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
Awesome. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
You too.
All right. So that was a sort of condensed conversation. Sean was expressing, I don't know how I can really affect change, and wasn't really personally impacted in a great way by coronavirus. So with that, I think Hadass is going to break us out into groups.
Yeah, hopefully I won't lose hosting abilities again. And we'll just be in those for like 5 minutes to brainstorm together a little bit about how to manage difficult conversations, I think, and then come back together so Jonah can give us some more info. So see you guys in 5, hopefully.
Give it like 10 seconds.
Well, while we're waiting, actually, I'll do that once we start. I don't want anyone to miss it. All right, I'm gonna go ahead, and then if anyone comes in later.
Yeah, I think we're good now.
So thanks everybody for coming. I hope that this was informative. I hope that you picked up some information, learned some tricks, and most of all, I hope that you're ready to get back out there and get organizing. Obviously, it's not canvassing, but I think that one thing that you should take away from this is that there are still ways to make a concrete difference and to actually push for our agenda. And our agenda is more vital now than ever. Our program is more urgently needed now than it has ever been before, and that's only going to increase as this goes on. So I really want to encourage you to phone bank with us generally, but especially this weekend. We are currently calling through people who we canvassed over the past few months and identified as Bernie supporters. So first of all, if you've been on a canvass with us before, this is a good way to kind of, there's some continuity here. You can call the people who you've been canvassing before, a little bit of that. It also means that you're going to be talking to people who are almost certainly on board with Medicare for All, who are on board with Bernie, who are generally going to be positive and enthusiastic towards the kinds of pitches that you're making. So if you've never phone banked before, you've done it once and you didn't like it, if you're a little unsure, this weekend is a really good way to start. So I'm going to drop the RSVP link in the chat. What we do when we phone bank is you sign up for a 2-hour shift, every shift has a moderator. The moderator will add you to a group chat and kind of guide you through the phone bank. So if you have any questions, you'll be in a group with people who can help you answer them. The moderator will remind you to take breaks. And just generally, I find, that I'm spending a lot of time sitting by myself, these days. So, it's just good to kind of be in a group and, have people to hang out with while you're doing this. So we are doing it Saturday and Sunday. There are 3 shifts that start at 10, 1, and 4 on both days.
Wait,
and,
Jeff, we adjusted it for this weekend. They're 11, 1, and 3.
11, 1, and 3, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, so 11, 1, and 3, Saturday and Sunday. And if you can't make it this weekend, we're doing it every weekend all the way through the election, which is June 2nd. So that's all. I want to thank you all again for coming out. If you're interested in more socialism, Philly DSA is continuing to do all of our events through Zoom. So we're doing Night School, which is a great political education event. If you've never done that before, it's basically a discussion group around kind of ideas from a socialist perspective. So last time they did healthcare, which was very interesting. We also have a capital reading group if you are someone who is maybe a little more advanced and ready to tackle Marx's Capital. And then if you go to the website, we'll also, we're doing panels, we're doing discussions. I think they did a Zoom happy hour this week. So we're still doing a lot of the stuff that we had been doing. We're just doing it remotely. So once again, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. And I hope you found this useful. If you have any feedback for us, let us know, because we would like to keep doing these, but we want them to be as useful for you as possible.